Pastor James Carter was the kind of man people looked up to. For over 15 years he had led Grace Community Church with unwavering dedication, delivering sermons that left the congregation inspired. His words carried wisdom, his presence radiated authority, and his devotion to God seemed unshakable. Every Sunday morning, families gathered under the church's high wooden beams, eager to hear his teachings. They saw him as a man of integrity, a shepherd guiding his flock with love and righteousness. Beside him stood his wife, Evelyn Carter, the perfect image of a devoted pastor's wife. She was graceful, kind-hearted, and deeply involved in church activities. Together, they appeared to be a couple blessed by faith and commitment. Evelyn had spent most of her adult life supporting James in his spiritual mission. She had met him in college when he was still a young man with big dreams of becoming a pastor. His passion for ministry had drawn her in, and soon she had found herself building a life around his calling. She took charge of organizing church events, mentoring younger women, and making sure their home was always open to those in need. While James stood at the pulpit delivering powerful sermons, she worked behind the scenes, making sure everything ran smoothly. But in recent months, something had changed. James had grown distant. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things she brushed aside as exhaustion or stress. He spent more time at the church, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. He seemed distracted even when he was home, responding with absent-minded nods whenever she spoke. There were moments when she caught him staring off into the distance, lost in thought, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. At first she assumed he was simply burdened by the responsibilities of leadership. Running a church wasn't easy, and he carried the weight of the congregation's problems on his shoulders. But deep down, an uneasy feeling began to grow anew. Sunday morning, Evelyn woke up early, as she always did, to prepare for the day. She dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that James had once said was his favorite. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her necklace, she glanced at the empty side of the bed. James had already left. It had become a routine. He would leave before sunrise, saying he needed to pray in solitude before the service. It wasn't unusual for a pastor to seek quiet time with God, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She arrived at the church a little later, greeted by the usual warm smiles of the congregation. As she moved through the crowd, she noticed the way people looked at her, some with admiration, others with curiosity. She had never questioned her place in James's life before, but today a strange sense of detachment settled over her. Something was coming. She just didn't know what. The service continued, but Evelyn could no longer focus. The words coming from James's mouth faded into the background as her thoughts raced. The momentary glance between him and Rachel had stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore any longer. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral, but her mind was working frantically to piece together every strange moment she had ignored in the past few months. The late nights, the sudden increase in meetings, the distant looks, the hushed phone calls. Things she had once dismissed as work-related stress now felt like signs of something far more personal and Rachel. Why had she never noticed before how much time Rachel spent around James? She was always at the church, always offering to help, always finding a reason to stay behind. Evelyn had thought nothing of it before, but now, a sickening feeling settled in her stomach. As the sermon ended, the congregation stood for the final prayer. Evelyn bowed her head, but her thoughts remained restless. When the service concluded, people began moving toward the church hall for coffee and refreshments, exchanging greetings and pleasantries as they went. Evelyn took her time, watching James as he stepped down from the pulpit. He was immediately surrounded by church members, shaking hands and offering smiles. His face was warm and inviting, but now Evelyn saw something else, a mask. She turned her attention to Rachel, who stood near the back of the sanctuary, speaking with another woman. There was tension in the way she held herself, as if she was nervous or distracted. Every few moments her gaze flickered toward James, but she quickly looked away as if afraid of being caught. Evelyn inhaled sharply. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. The way Rachel's hands trembled, slightly, the way James avoided looking in her direction too often. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. Determined to keep her composure, Evelyn made her way to the church hall. She greeted the usual group of women who often gathered to discuss upcoming events and charity work. But as she stood there, nodding along to the conversation, she couldn't shake the awareness prickling at her skin. She felt like an outsider in her own life, standing in the middle of a place that had once been her sanctuary, now tainted by suspicion. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed James slipping away. He moved quickly through the crowd, offering polite nods as he walked toward his office. Less than a minute later, Rachel followed, her pace cautious, her movements deliberate. Evelyn felt her heartbeat hammer in her chest. This was it, the confirmation she had been dreading. Every doubt, every unease, every ignored instinct had led to this moment. Without hesitation, she turned on her heel and followed them, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. Evelyn moved through the hall with careful, measured steps, her pulse racing beneath her composed exterior. The church was filled with the usual chatter of congregants, but she barely heard any of it. Her focus remained on James and Rachel, who had disappeared down the hallway leading to the pastor's office. She knew she had to be cautious. If she acted too impulsively, she risked being noticed. If she hesitated, she might lose her chance to finally see the truth for herself. She reached the hallway, her breath shallow as she stepped into the quieter space. The noise of the congregation faded behind her, replaced by the steady thudding of her own heartbeat. Ahead, James's office door was slightly ajar. Light spilled from the crack, casting a thin glow onto the hallway floor. Voices drifted from inside, low, urgent whispers. She crept closer, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the small opening, her stomach twisted into knots. James stood close to Rachel, too close. His head was tilted downward, his expression serious, but there was something else in his eyes, something Evelyn had not seen directed at her in a long time. Rachel's hands clutched his forearm, her fingers pressing into the fabric of his sleeve. Their body language told a story far more damning than any words could. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to burst in, to demand answers, but she forced herself to stay still. If she interrupted now, they would deny everything. They would make excuses, twist the truth, and she would be left feeling like the paranoid wife who imagined things that weren't there. No. She needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. Rachel spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Though Evelyn couldn't make out every word, she caught enough. Words like risk, careful, and someone might suspect sent chills down her spine. James responded just as quietly, his tone firm but not rejecting. It was the way he spoke, the familiarity, the concern, that confirmed everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an innocent conversation. Her fingers curled into fists as she forced herself to step back, retreating before she could be seen. The walls of the church, once a place of safety and devotion, now felt suffocating. The truth was out, in the open, and yet she was the only one who saw it. She walked back toward the main hall, her vision blurring at the edges. Every familiar face, every warm greeting now felt hollow. How long had this been going on? How many Sundays had she sat in the front pew, listening to James preach about faithfulness and honesty while he carried this secret? As she reached the doorway, she made a decision. She would not let this betrayal remain in the shadows. She had spent years standing beside James, supporting him, believing in him. Now, she would uncover the truth for everyone to see. Evelyn spent the rest of the afternoon going through the motions, smiling when expected, nodding at conversations she barely heard, all while a storm brewed inside her. The weight of what she had just witnessed pressed heavily on her chest, but she refused to let it break her. She had spent too many years building her life around James, trusting him, believing in the man he claimed to be. Now, she saw him for who he truly was, a hypocrite, a liar, a man who had betrayed not only his marriage, but his entire congregation. She knew that confronting him outright wouldn't be enough. He would deny it, twist the truth, maybe even make her feel like she was overreacting. No, she needed proof, something undeniable that he couldn't talk his way out of, and she knew exactly how to get it. That evening, after James had gone to bed, she made her way back to the church under the cover of darkness. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door, stepping inside the dimly lit sanctuary. The silence was eerie, the weight of the empty pews pressing in on her. This place had once been a source of comfort, a home. Now it felt like a battleground. She moved quickly, making her way to James's office. If they had met there once, they would meet there again. She took out a small hidden camera she had purchased earlier that evening, placing it carefully on the bookshelf, angled perfectly toward his desk. It was a risk, but one she was willing to take. She needed to see it with her own eyes, capture their betrayal in a way that could never be denied. The next day, Evelyn kept a close watch on James. He acted as if nothing had changed, smiling, laughing, playing the role of the devoted pastor and husband. But now she saw the cracks in his performance, the brief moments of distraction, the glances toward his phone, the way he lingered a little too long after service. And just as she suspected, he found a way to slip away. She waited, giving him time, before making her way toward his office once more. Her heart pounded as she retrieved the hidden camera and hurried home. She locked herself in the bedroom, plugging the device into her laptop, hands shaking as she opened the footage. The screen flickered to life, and there it was. James and Rachel, alone in the office, their bodies close, their voices hushed. She watched as he reached for her hand, as she leaned into him, as their whispered words confirmed everything she had feared. Her worst nightmare played out before her eyes, undeniable, irreversible. Evelyn felt her breath hitch, but she didn't cry. The betrayal was deep, but so was her resolve. She had the proof she needed. Now it was time to make sure everyone else saw it too. Evelyn sat in the dim glow of the laptop screen, staring at the footage that confirmed her worst fears. Every whispered word, every stolen glance, every touch between James and Rachel played out like a slow, agonizing nightmare. There was no room for doubt anymore. Her husband, the man who preached about loyalty and righteousness every Sunday, was a fraud. The pain of betrayal twisted inside her, but instead of breaking down, she felt something else rise within her. Determination. This secret would not remain hidden any longer. She spent the rest of the night preparing. Every detail had to be right. She transferred the footage onto a USB drive, making multiple copies, ensuring there was no way James could cover this up. When morning arrived, she dressed as she always did, maintaining the same calm demeanor she had worn for years. James greeted her with a kiss on the cheek before leaving for the church, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. By the time Evelyn arrived, the congregation was already gathering. It was another Sunday, another sermon, another performance by James Carter. The irony of it all made her sick. She took her usual seat in the front pew, but this time she wasn't there to listen. She was there to watch everything fall apart. The service began as usual. The choir sang, the congregation prayed, and then James took his place at the pulpit. He looked out over the church, his voice steady and commanding as he spoke about faith, commitment, and the importance of honesty. Evelyn clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Then, at the perfect moment, she made her move. She stood, calm and composed, and walked toward the back of the church where the audio-visual system was set up. The technician looked surprised, but Evelyn simply handed him the USB drive and whispered, "Play it." He hesitated, confused, but the authority in her voice left no room for argument. Seconds later, the projector flickered, and the footage began playing on the large screen behind James. The congregation fell silent as the scene unfolded. James and Rachel in his office, their closeness undeniable, their betrayal exposed for all to see. Gasps echoed through the church. Some people covered their mouths, others turned to one another in shock. James froze at the pulpit, his face draining of color. Rachel, seated in the middle of the congregation, let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. David, her husband, looked at her in stunned silence before slowly rising to his feet. Evelyn finally stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This is the man you have trusted. This is the man who preaches about righteousness." She turned to James, her eyes steady. "You have deceived your family. You have deceived this church." James opened his mouth to speak, but the damage was already done. His secret was out, and there was no sermon in the world that could save him now.